All right, hello everyone. My name is Dylan Mangel with Nebraska Extension, and today I'm going to give a little bit of an update for our in-service here on soybean diseases across the state. So 2025 was not a bad year for soybeans overall. It seemed like a lot of yields turned out better than expected. A lot of people were really happy with how those yielded. And it was a little bit surprising because of the perfect disease conditions we really had over the year. And as evidence for those perfect disease conditions, we all know what happened with corn and the southern rust. That was just horrible. But that did not translate to soybeans. One reason is just because we don't suffer from the foliar problems in soybean production like we do in corn. Really, our foliar issues are limited to frog eye leaf spot, for example, or white mold. You could consider one of those, although it's not a polycyclic foliar problem. So we really just didn't have the diseases that liked the type of wet conditions we had. So let's talk through a little bit of those, and I will update on what problems we did see out there. So the three biggest issues we had in soybean, I think, were soybean cyst nematode. Sudden death syndrome was also a big issue in lots of the state. And soybean white mold, while it wasn't as bad as 2023, it was still there and still widespread across the state. So soybean cyst nematode, it's the number one biotic yield limiting agent of soybean. It impacts a huge amount of acres, and a lot of the yield is lost to it. That adds up to something like $1.5 billion a year in the U.S., so it's extremely significant. But it's not obvious in every field, and oftentimes it's because this can cause yield loss without those above ground symptoms. Here's just some basic images of the biology. We've got the top left, which is the eggs. We've got and if you look in these eggs, notice it's just a juvenile nematode folded over itself. So it's in there. And when it hatches out, it's going to look like this juvenile, which is the next one over. That's males and females are going to swim to the roots. They're going to start to feed at those roots. The females are then going to stay there and develop a complex relationship with that root, in which the root is they've built basically a home there, and the root is bringing resources to those females, so they're able to survive in one spot. The males are then going to leave, go fertilize the females that have stayed there. As you can see here, those females are then going to start to grow as they grow the next generation of the nematodes inside of it, ultimately becoming these round cysts full of eggs that are going to then start this cycle over again. This process can take place in about 28 days, so it's very quick. Each of these cysts is going to be full of new nematodes. Here's a cyst right there, and that could be several hundred fairly easily. So each female can then turn into several hundred in just 28 days. So you can go from a low number of nematodes to a tremendous amount of nematodes in a single season, where you have maybe 4 or so generations. That's why any level of nematodes in your field is at a management level already. You need to manage if you have any of them present. And that doesn't always mean seed treatments, but it does mean some of the other cultural practices that I'll talk about here in a minute. The symptoms of SCN in those fields is, in its worst case, going to be stunting. So you can see a stunted field right here. That's extremely rare. I don't see that often. Maybe once a year we see levels like that in a field. However, a lot of fields are impacted and they're losing significant levels of yield, but you're not going to see it. Water can help hide those symptoms. So in irrigated areas, it might cover that up. Here's a picture of a root system. We've got a nodule here marked in blue, and then we have these red arrows pointing to cysts, which will give you an idea of the scale. I can't see these with my unaided eye. Some people can, but if you hope to see them, you've got to find them in a really sandy soil. then you've got to pull those roots up lightly and wash them very lightly. Otherwise they'll fall off because they're not really attached that well. The management recommendations we make are based on, first of all, knowing if you have it. That's the only way you're going to be able to monitor it and determine if your management is working. Then you've got the choice to rotate resistant varieties. Third, you can rotate to a non-host crop. Thankfully, corn is a non-host, so that works really well with the common rotation here. And last, consider using a nematode protectant seed treatment. I talked about testing and the importance of it. In Nebraska and several other Midwestern states, there are free testing programs for anyone interested in knowing if they have soybean cyst nematode in their fields. In Nebraska, it's extremely simple. If you bring soil to the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic, my lab's going to take those and test them. We're just basically going to count the nematodes in there and then let the sample submitter know what nematode level is in that soil sample. If growers would like free sample bags, they can just go online to this address here and submit a request with their address. It's just a simple form, and I'll just mail them directly to that grower. Or if you want those for your education offices, let me know and I will send those out. But when you do a soil test, I'm going to send you a number back, and I'll say you have 1,500 eggs per 100 cc of soil. What does that mean, though, to a grower? It's really hard for them to picture that. It's hard for anyone to picture what that means to yield. So what we've done, I'm co-leading a project called the SCN Coalition now with Ohio State University, and we've built this tool called the SCN Profit Checker, which allows you to put in the results of that soil test, and it'll help predict for you what type of or what level of yield loss you're losing. 1,500 eggs here. You can also put in the female index, although that's also auto-populated based on state averages for growers that don't know it, because a test won't provide that. And then the soil specifics in that field, like the sand and the soil pH, those two numbers really impact the level of yield loss that the nematodes are going to have. And that's going to come down to something like a 5.7% yield loss. That's pretty common, yield loss at that level. And SCN is not the number one yield limiting agent of soybean because it's completely blowing out some fields. The problem is it's in a lot of fields, and it's just taken that 5% or 4% or 3% tax off the top of everything. That adds up to a lot of money. So here's just an example of that profit checker with the Nebraska state averages. So our median soil sample egg count is about 4,000 as far as positive samples go. The female index is averaging about 35% here in Nebraska. I'll explain more of what that number is in a minute. The sand percent, I've just put in 20 and a pH of 6.5, and that's going to yield about a 6% yield loss. We've got the economic information down here below. You can put in the current soybean price, and it's going to, in your area, and it's going to give you an estimate of what that loss in dollars is going to add up to. Now, everyone's been hearing about soybean cyst nematode for a lot of years. People are probably tired about hearing about soybean cyst nematode, but we can't let that fatigue evolve into not doing anything about the problem. SCN damage is growing. It's getting worse, and there's two reasons. The first is just expansion into new fields. The map here shows where it's at in red. The blue counties are counties that it showed up just in the last year or so when we published the latest update of this map. So it's still spreading, but if you notice, it's pretty much in all the soybean producing counties. Unless you get up here in North Dakota, there's still room for it to head a little bit west, but it's in a lot of the counties where soybeans grown, especially the majority. But that does not mean it's in every field. If we look at Nebraska data, you can see here the positivity rates of soil samples we receive. So at its highest, we'll say 60% of soil samples are positive in counties like Antelope. That tends to be a hot spot up in the Northeast here. But we've got a lot of areas that are 30% positive. So there's potential for SCN yield loss to easily double based on just spreading to new fields. And this still continues to spread in fields, especially as farmers drive equipment from one positive field to a field that's not positive. It's going to expand. Ultimately, we'll get to a time where this is in every field. So there's a lot of upside. The other reason this is growing and getting worse is because resistance sources are breaking down. Our second recommendation here is to rotate resistant varieties. There's 2 widely available resistance sources in the varieties. PI 88788 is the most common, and it's in something like 80% of the varieties available. It's been like that for a while. Lately, peaking has been increasing in the varieties as well. And the reason is because 88788 is having reduced effectiveness. It's just not as effective as it once was. Peaking is extremely effective. It's actually more effective than 88788 ever was. Peaking has had a tough time getting bred into varieties because it's 2 genes instead of just a single gene. And it's much harder to breed when you've got 2 genes you're trying to move at the same time. There's more potential for yield drag, for example. So while peaking's been around for a while, it hasn't been popular because it's taken a lot longer for it to get put in really good genetic backgrounds. Now, 10 years on from when 88788 started to fail, or we noticed it, peaking is in very good backgrounds, and the varieties are doing better than the 88788 varieties, especially on SCN fields. The problem with peaking is related to it working better than 88788 ever did. It's likely that the nematodes will evolve to overcome it faster than 88788. So we're probably going to lose both of these resistance genes. We already have evidence that I'll show in a minute that we're losing peaking too. So the way we can maintain these and their remaining effectiveness as long as possible is by rotating them. And it's important that you rotate them every time you plant a new variety in a field for soybean. So if we just look at how that resistance gene breakdown is impacting yield loss. The last example I showed had a female index of 35%. That means that nematode reproduction on that variety is only 35% as good as it is on a susceptible variety. So in that case, this resistance gene 88788 is still fairly effective. Numbers are a lot lower, although it's deceiving those counts. Any level of reproduction is still going to expand quickly. But if we come over here to this example where our female index is suddenly 90%, so the 88788 resistance source is something like only 10% effective compared to what it used to be, we get a yield loss of 15.5%. You might say that's an extreme level, 90%, but I'll show our results here in Nebraska in a minute. Also, a count of 4,000 is not that high. That's the middle of the road. We can see 20,000, we can see 40,000, we can see 100,000 eggs per 100 cc of soil. And those numbers, as this continues to evolve, might become more common. That's why rotating these resistance genes is extremely important. That 15% is going to cost growers something like $100 an acre. So it's a big change. Here is that Nebraska data, and a student in my lab, Olivia Dooley, has been working on this, as well as a previous student, Pratibha Karki. They've been characterizing the nematode populations and their ability to overcome that resistance, those resistance genes. Now there's a lot of resistance genes available, but they're just not in the varieties. It's hard to breed these. They may not perform well, so they're not making it out of breeding programs into the catalogs. We end up with just numbers 1 and 2 here, peaking in 88788. Those are the 2 I discussed. We test those and these others, as well as susceptible lines for comparisons in a system like this, where we've got a lot of replication, but each pot you could think of as one replication, where we've got the susceptibles, a single nematode population, all the resistance lines, and say we replicate that 6 times. This experiment looks like about one nematode population figuring out what resistance genes it could overcome. We take those soil samples from there, we sieve them through, separate out the cysts that you can see in the second picture here and in the third picture, and we'll count those cysts, and then we'll crush those and we'll count the nematode eggs inside of them, because you can get varying levels of egg reproduction inside a female too. Now, here's just a little better explainer on what female index is. That's that auto-populating number that I've ranged from 35 to 90%. It's basically the mean number of females on one of the test lines over, so say the mean level of females on PA 8788 over the mean number of females on the susceptible comparison times 100. Anytime you get over 10%, that's called elevated reproduction on the resistant lines, and that's a problem. So as an example, if we have 100 cysts on 88788, and we have 1,000 on the susceptible, times that by 100, we've got a female index of 10. In that case, you'd say 88788 is still pretty resistant to those nematodes. But if we have 900 cysts on 88788 and 1,000 on the susceptible check, your female index is suddenly 90. And that resistance source would not be very effective. So if we look at our data from Nebraska so far, the last 2 years of testing, differential line 2 is called is PA 88788. That's the main one. 80% of Nebraska populations can overcome that at some level. Also of concern, differential line 1 is peaking, and already 26% of populations are overcoming that peaking resistance source. If we dig deeper into those numbers, the average female index for 88788 of all the samples we've tested is around 25%. So that's pretty bad. But the maximum female index in Nebraska is 87%. So there are growers, and there wasn't just one of these, there's several, many. There are growers with fields where 88788 just is basically completely ineffective. Even more scary is we have fields where peaking is also relatively ineffective. Its female index is almost 60%. So we've got 2 available resistance genes, rapidly degrading. The only hope for maintaining these as long as possible is to rotate between those 2 and rotate with non-host crops and monitor those levels to make sure that's working. If levels get completely out of hand, growers could switch to a 1-year soybean, 2 years of corn operation. But based on this nematode reproduction, they've developed mechanisms to wait in the soil. And while there is some mortality from 1 year to the next, after 2 years of corn, those remaining nematodes have basically set up to only be triggered by soybean, so they will wait for many years. You really can't rotate away from them, so you've just got to do your best at pairing these management tools to keep it as low as possible. We've still got some level of 88788 that is effective against some level or some number of those populations, but ultimately some is completely susceptible, some is moderate, and some is just moderately resistant, but those will fall quickly. Rotation is the name of the game. Again, free testing. If anyone wants free sample bags or anything, request them here, I'll mail them out. Otherwise, send growers with whatever bag of soil they have to the UNL Plant Pest Diagnostic Clinic. We're going to count those for free and send out the data. Okay, the next thing in Nebraska was white mold. It was not nearly at the level that we had it in 2023 in Nebraska. However, we monitored about 10 fields closely this year that had a history of white mold in 2023, and we had white mold in every single one of those 10 fields. It was there, but it just didn't quite have the temperatures needed for it to get out of hand like it did in 2023. It was slightly warmer, about 6 degrees warmer on average in July of 25 than it was in July of 23, and that makes a huge difference. Probably also is what contributed to southern rust that Tamara's going to talk about. Here's a picture that we took of some of that beginning of the white mold life cycle this year. These are called apothecia. They're little mushrooms that make spores in this cup, growing out of a sclerotia that's buried in the ground. Here's a more mature apothecia. It flattens out. The spores are coming off the top side of this. Here's a picture of those spores. They're extremely fragile. They're clear. A little bit of sun is going to wipe these out. So if you've got open or more open canopies, that's going to contribute to that mortality of these. Warmer conditions, more mortality. After they infect a plant, they're going to grow these sclerotia on the sides of the plant as well as inside of the plant. That'll fall free to the soil, and you'll get more of these next time. Those sclerotia remained from 2023 to 2025. That's what started this. There will be some in 2 years when beans rotate back into those fields, not just from 2025, but also still from 2023. They're extremely durable. They'll last for a decade. You can't rotate away from white mold either. It's just going to be there forever once you have it. Here's a tool we've developed with the Crop Protection Network. A lot of data goes into this. It's simply a fungicide efficacy table that's going to help growers pick a product that's going to work well for the disease they have. So a lot of stuff's not labeled and not effective against white mold. So don't let growers choose a product without making sure that it's going to actually be effective against the disease they have. Sudden death syndrome was a major issue in Nebraska this year. It was pretty dry around planting. A lot of beans got in. We even planted a field dry. Right before a rainstorm, it was warm. We got them in, but we got really cold rains. Soil temperatures dove in large areas of the state after those cool rains. They just didn't have the heat capacity that a more wet soil is going to have to resist that. That decreased soil temperatures, and those beans sat in cold temperatures for a little while, and that's when sudden death syndrome likes to infect. It hit large areas of the state, especially in the southwest, in the southeast. But an important management tool for sudden death, one of my favorite ways to manage disease, because it's the most economical, is picking a resistant variety. This is different varieties in our TAPS plots from last year, and we've actually had sudden death in the last 2 years of TAPS plots. We've had it pretty bad. But you can see just how big of a difference there is between these two varieties. It's night and day. The seed catalogs have ratings for it. Encourage growers to take the time to, if they've got fields with a history of this, take the time to put a good variety in there. It's going to pay dividends, and you're not going to pay a premium for a resistant variety. Okay, the next thing is new disease, red crown rot. It's been in the south for a while, but suddenly it's moving into the Midwest. It's not in Nebraska yet, or it hasn't been verified here yet. It's not just going to cause red staining on stems that you can see here, but it's also going to have little growths actually on the stems. Here's where it's been as far as 2024. It was just showing up in Illinois and Indiana. but recently it's really started to expand. This is the map I was showing through last summer about where red crown rot was. We've got a couple hundred miles from the southeast corner of Nebraska to where it was. But at the end of the year, this popped up. We had a jump into Wisconsin, and then the one that really got me was this jump all the way here to Minnesota, the very extreme southwest county in Minnesota. If we zoom in, the mileage on that is a concerning 75 miles. That hits close to home. But if we look back, it's all the way here, it's all the way here. It's certainly in between these areas. It's probably in Iowa, it's probably further west in Missouri, and I'd venture to say it's probably in Nebraska already. The problem is the foliar symptoms look a lot like sudden death syndrome. So it often doesn't stand out, especially in bad years of sudden death syndrome. It's hard to find these areas when you've got both of them. I looked at a lot of fields in the southeast this year before that northeast one showed up. But I think in future years I'll spend more time in the northeast and in the southeast still trying to find this to make sure it's here. I've decided I'm not going to start any research related to this pathogen until we've verified it in the state. I don't want to bring any isolates in for lab use, for example, only until we have it here. So basically, we're not touching it until we have it. And as soon as we have it, I think there's research dollars out there that could support this, but we need to identify it first. So if any of you have seen this or seen anything like it, I'd be happy to look. Feel free to send me pictures. We'll get to the bottom of that. These actually are really good pictures from Boris Camilletti at the University of Illinois. He's been leading up a lot of this research as his state's been hardest hit in the north central region by this. Right here is where we put out a lot of our extension material through social media. So if you'd like to follow any of this news on there, feel free to like and subscribe to those channels. Otherwise, here's some of our other resources where you can find me or the rest of the extension team on social media. If anyone has any questions about any of these slides, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk whenever. I'm happy to look at pictures. I'm happy to troubleshoot samples anytime. So feel free to contact me or just come on into the UNL Plant Pest Diagnostic Clinic where my office is located. Thanks everyone for watching. I appreciate it.